This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Several years ago, I was invited to a conference, and as usually happens, I was asked to provide a title for a talk. And the title I came up with, though why I did so is still a bit lost to me, was what is to be done and who is going to do it where. And I thought this was a pretty good title, but when I get to the conference, I found that the where had been left off the program. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy for conference organizers. They always seem totally frazzled, and so I didn't want to complain or do anything of that sort. So I just left it as it was. But later on, I mentioned to one of the organizers it was a pity we didn't deal with the where, particularly since, as a geographer, I'm always interested in the geography of struggle, the geography of what is going on in terms of anti-capitalist activity. And to my surprise, the organizer said, "Oh no, we deliberately left it off." And I said, well, but why? And the answer was, well, we thought it would make it far, far too complicated. And in any case, if you could answer the question of what is to be done and who is going to do it, that would be perfectly satisfactory. Now, I'm not going to, at this point, get back into the geography question, but I think that this is a perennial kind of problem I have, which is that as soon as you get into wanting to talk about the geography, it tends to get left out. It tends to get pushed to one side as somehow or other being less important than the major issue, which is what is to be done and who is going to do it. So let me talk a little bit about this question here. What is to be done? Of course, in the grand scheme of things, I'm interested in the question of anti-capitalist struggle, which means weaning us away from a mode of production, the laws of which are driving us into environmental disaster and into really serious kind of economic and political as well as social problems. And there is therefore a search for an alternative mode of production which is going to, if you like, satisfy human wants and needs, but do it in a way in which the negatives of the capitalist system are going to be abolished without necessarily abolishing some of the positives. So that would be the general kind of question. But given where we are right now, and after 30 or 40 years of neoliberalism, it would seem that an anti-neoliberal stance might be a really good place to start on that whole kind of quest for an alternative. Because one of the things that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years is the commodification of everything. And the increasing commodification and marketization of everything, and the insistence that activity should actually be mediated through the market in almost all different spheres, that this world is one which in itself has transformed life in some ways which I think are highly negative, and that therefore an initial step on the question of what is to be done would be to try to roll back that which has occurred under neoliberalism, which we might find most objectionable. And if commodification is one of those things which is most objectionable, then this would mean that a politics of decommodification and, if you like, movement of activities away from the market should be one of the immediate objectives of where we're at. Now, my own way of approaching this in the first instance is to say we need to think about anti-capitalist struggle as being waged all over the place, not in one specific place, but in many, many different places. The classic Marxian thinking about this is, of course, to focus on the question of production, the production of value and the production of surplus value, and to say that socialism is about recapturing the capacity to produce and reproduce value for those who actually engage in the work, that is, the working population, the working classes. The way I look at this is to say, if we think of the circulation of capital in general, we would look at a circulation process where there are multiple stress points, and each stress point carries with it the possibility of anti-capitalist struggle. The first stress point is, of course, the point of production, where production occurs. And it is here that most Marxists have focused because that is where value is produced, and that is where surplus value is appropriated as well as produced. This is the point that Marx talks about when he talks about valorization. The valorization of capital is the augmentation and the reproduction of the value and the surplus value on a continuous basis. And this entails, of course, the relationship between capital and labour. It is therefore very clearly here that we see the lineaments of class struggle. It is capital, with all of its powers of command over money and value and all the rest of it, and it is labour that produces that, but which is alienated from that which it produces, because the capitalist has control over the labour process, has control over the product, and therefore has a right to appropriate the value which is created in production. So the history of the left has been very much focused on class struggle as it is waged at the point of production. But if you look at the totality of circulation of capital, Marx points out that, of course, value is produced in this activity of production, but it has to be realized in the market. And the realization of value in the market means the transformation of the commodity that is made into something which is beyond that, which is the transformation is from the commodity form into the money form, and it is there that the capitalist realizes profit in money form, which is, if you like, the transformation of surplus value into the monetized form. So there is a whole operation of realization. And at the very beginning of Capital, Marx kind of says, well, if you can't realize something, then there is no value. And if you can only partially realize it, then you're not going to realize the whole value. So that the question of realization is an important issue. And therefore, here too, there is a point of struggle, a point of potential conflict. Because those who are trying to market the product, and this can be the merchant capitalist or it can be the producer capitalist taking their own product to market, is engaged in a process of trying to maximize the monetary return and will be doing all kinds of things to try to create, as it were, more money than would actually be warranted given the amount of labor input which has occurred in production. One of the ways in which this is done is to try to create goods which have special kind of value, what we would call positional goods, or in another way would be to say that if we can brand a commodity, we can demand more money for it than would really be warranted by its value. So there's a constant struggle going on the part of those who are in charge of realizing the value in the marketplace to try to get more money than is really warranted by the value. And this, therefore, means there's fierce competition in the marketplace. Now, that competition in the marketplace presumes that the market is a fair market and that it is a competitive market. But you've then got to deal with the way in which much of the market is actually monopolized. And if it's monopolized, then whoever has the commodity can charge a monopoly price. And the monopoly price is, of course, much greater than would be the case if you simply traded the commodity at its value. So what happens then is that there is actually struggle emerges over monopoly pricing in the market, and struggle also over, in fact, pricing in general in the market. Now, we've had some examples in the United States in recent years The famous example was this hedge fund manager who purchased this drug company that created a drug which was I think it was an anti-HIV drug, which was a very important one, and it was selling for something like $7.50 a pill. The hedge fund manager bought up the company, turned it around, and then started to market the same pill for $750 a pill. Now, $7.50 a pill as opposed to $7.50 a pill is a huge increase. It was something like a 5,000% increase in the price of the pill. Now, what does this then do? It means that there is going to be some struggle over the price of the pill. In this instance, it was so shocking what had happened that a lot of public opinion got involved, and a lot of argument went on about the right and the ability to do this. In terms of the market itself, doing something like that does not actually add up to something that's illegal. It can be considered unethical in the sense that somebody's being extra greedy and therefore it's not playing the rules of the game as we normally think it should be played. But it's not really illegal. I mean, anybody who goes to market has the right to take their commodity there, offer it for sale at whatever price they want. And then if people don't want to pay that price, then they don't get the commodity. The problem in this case was this was a pill that was perfectly important to a certain number of people in terms of their health and well-being, and that without the pill, certain people would die. And that seemed to be really, really unethical and therefore not to be tolerated. So a struggle emerges at the point of realization. And those struggles which occur in the market are very often about market power, who has the market power, and how to structure that market power in such a way that it gives equitable outcomes. In the case of this HIV pill, there are a number of possibilities. One is that the drug companies would, in fact, themselves negotiate with the insurance companies, so that the insurance companies would say, "Okay, we will take this $750 a pill." In this instance, the insurance company could probably absorb that because there were not that many people reliant on this particular pill, and the insurance companies could pay it, and it would just be a very marginal increase in the aggregate cost of the insurance companies. But you can see that if enough of this goes on, the effect is that insurance companies are going to have to raise their premiums in order to deal with the fact that drug prices have been increasing for this monopolistic reason. And it turned out that while this one spectacular example was there, if you look at big pharmacy in general, pretty much all drugs, including even generic drugs, have gone up dramatically in price over the last few years. And there's no indication that those increases in prices are really due to increases in cost of production. Almost everything is an increase in price, which is a return to monopoly power of big pharmaceutical companies. And the average increase of non-generic drugs, that is the sort of bare drugs and the rest of it, has been something of the order of 20 or 30% over the last 10 or 15 years. And what this means is that there's going to be a struggle over drug prices, and we start to see that being waged politically. We start to see this being orchestrated by different factions who are trying to push the drug companies to bring down their prices. And of course, one of the ways in which you could do that is you could use that part of the drug market which is in the public's hands, that is Medicare, Medicaid, and the pharmaceutical capacities that go with that. And you would use monopsony power, that is the power of big government to negotiate prices so that you bring them down. And if you have a big enough demand, an associated demand, you can then drive the price of the good down. And this, of course, is what some of the companies do, and in fact some of the some of the merchant capitalists do. I mean, this is how Walmart operates, for example. Walmart can sell cheap goods because it negotiates with all of its suppliers and drives the prices to the suppliers down, the producers down and down and down. So there's a struggle which goes on over realization. And this is a political struggle which is very important, but it is not exactly the same in terms of its class configuration as the struggle which goes on at the point of production. After all, everybody who is involved in pharmaceutical products and needs drug prescriptions fulfilled, all of those people are actually against the drug companies. So it's not as if it's just the working class or working people. Everybody is likely to become involved in having a very strong interest in lower drug prices. So you have these two sites of struggle. One is at the point of production, and the other is over the realization of value in the market. And this struggle over realization is, in my view, very much underplayed in much of the left literature. But at the same, as we start to think about how to orchestrate the struggle against capital, then we have to think about how we act and how we organize at the point of realization, because behind realization there exists another aspect of struggle, which is over the existence of wants, needs, and desires in a society. You can't sell a drug unless somebody wants, needs, or desires it. You can't sell a commodity unless somebody wants, needs, and desires it. So the history of capital has been very much about the creation of new wants, needs, and desires. Now, we think about this, we think about advertising and all of that, and of course that is important. But even more significant is actually the creation of a whole way of life, a way of life which internalizes certain wants, needs, and desires. For example, we've set up a mode of life in the United States. Let's call it suburbanization. What is it that suburbanization requires? It requires that you have an automobile. It requires that you have a lawnmower. It requires that you have all kinds of goods and services available to you. And the creation of that way of life was actually about the creation of new wants, needs, and desires. So we find ourselves constantly living in a society where capital is creating new wants, needs, and desires. For example, I'm sure everybody I'm talking to has a cell phone. Well, we didn't know what a cell phone was 20 years ago. We had no want, need, and desire for a cell phone. Along came cell phones, and now we've created a way of life where if you don't have a cell phone, then you're in sort of real difficulty. And that's what I mean by the creation of wants, needs, and desires, which means the creation of a way of life where we don't have a choice, that it is necessary that we have a cell phone. It is necessary in the United States for most people that they have an automobile. It is necessary that you have a refrigerator. It is necessary that you have these things, so that the creation of a way of life lies behind this. And then the struggles over that way of life. Is this the way of life you would have chosen to lead? Many people at various points have become very frustrated with the way of life of suburbia and wanted to come back into the city. When you come back into the city, you find other ways of life which are being created. So the struggle which goes on at the point of realization is not simply about the struggle over prices and the fight that goes on. It's also struggles over ways of life, wants, needs, and desires, and the possibility of having enough money to fulfill those wants, needs, and desires, given the way in which value has been produced in commodity form. So you take those two moments in the circulation process, production of value, realization of value, and you look at the nature of the struggle which goes on in both of them. And both of them are at a certain point involved in anti-capitalist struggle. That is, an anti-capitalist struggle over the creation of wants, needs, and desires. An anti-capitalist struggle over the way in which the market is manipulated and therefore there is going to likely be a coalition of people who are fighting against what is going on in the market and how it's going on. We see this most clearly in an area like housing. House is produced, it has a value, it's going to be marketed, but then, of course, we have a lot of speculation goes on housing values and trading of housing values, and speculation in housing markets drives prices up, and it means that we have nowhere to live at our income level. And again, there is a creation of a way of life and a process in which we get an urbanization process which makes it extremely difficult for many people to find a place to live. So in New York City, we have a large segment of the population which is trying to live on less than $50,000 a year. Now, it's very hard to find a place to live on $50,000 a year. If you've got $30,000 a year, which is sort of a more modest level still, it's almost impossible to find a place to live. So you have a crisis of housing. So you have a fight over housing. Homeless people fighting for a place to live. People fighting for affordable housing. And again, it's over what is going on in the market. But again, that struggle does not have the same political dimension as the class struggle in the point of production. Struggles against housing speculation, struggles against gentrification, struggles against the reorganization of social life in the city around a way of life which many people feel is alienating and antagonistic to their real wants and needs and desires. Those are areas of struggle where you find all kinds of people involved, not in the same way that they're involved at the point of production. So then the question arises, how do you create an alliance between all of those struggles which are going on the point of realization and all of those struggles which are going on at the point of production? This is, if you like, one of the big problems which exists in our current society. And that problem is one which also connects to other issues in the total circulation of capital, which need to be integrated into it. For example, working class has to be reproduced. There is a question of social reproduction. And how does social reproduction relate to realization questions and to production questions? So that when we get into the questions of social reproduction, we find a whole set of other issues that begin to be significant. And here, too, there comes to be cultural questions, but also what are the struggles really about? And I think what I will really want to do is to start to put together those three elements: social reproduction, production, and realization, and start to argue about an anti-capitalist perspective on each of those moments in the circulation process of capital, and put those three things together and then say, all right, how do we have a collective political battle which deals with the issues of production at the same time as it deals with the questions of realization and deals also with the questions of social reproduction and what that means. And that's, of course, social reproduction in the neighborhood, social reproduction in the community, if you want to call it that, social reproduction in the family or the household, and social reproduction, it also entails many other aspects of divisions of labor, gender questions, and the like. And those issues start to become prominent not only in social reproduction, but also, of course, in production and realization. So what I would want to do is to say, if we want to decommodify, if we want to create an alternative, then we have to seize hold of these three areas of production, realization, and social reproduction, and we have to have a coherent politics which says we have to find a non-capitalist way of organizing social reproduction, a non-capitalist way of dealing with the question of realization, and a non-capitalist way of dealing with the organization of production. And those three things taken together seem to me to be a crucial aspect of what social struggle is going to be about in coming years. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.